Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back this week, as is Julie Linzer. As promised, she is back to talk about Captain America, the Winter Soldier, and, I'm sure we'll make our way to Civil War here pretty soon, maybe in, a month or two, just to keep them spaced out a little bit. But Julie, how are you doing today?
Good. I'm excited to talk about, this is one of my favorite Marvel movies, so.
Awesome. Yeah, when I was rewatching it, I was like, yeah, I think I definitely like this one a little bit better than the first one they did, because like we mentioned in that episode, they were sort of still getting their bearings with these stories and everything. And by the time Winter Soldier came out, it's like you had the Avengers team up, you had the first Captain America movie, you had all this backstory basically that sort of led up to this. And in this one, we get, the big Shield versus Hydra situation, and this actually plays into Agents of Shield on TV as well. So it's like they really did the whole world building thing by the time they got to this movie. But why don't we go ahead and start with some of the relationships that we see either forming or already have formed with Captain America in this, because, Bucky ends up being the Winter Soldier, and hopefully by now everyone who is listening to this has seen the movie, so spoilers are kind of a given with this podcast, just in case we have any new listeners. But with Cap being frozen in ice and sort of waking up, however many years later, I think it was about 70 years later or something ridiculous like that.
Yep.
His relationships that he had with people aren't really there anymore, and then to have Bucky be in this, it's sort of like a big blow to him, especially with them fighting each other. And what do you think about the fact that they let it take so long for Cap to realize that this was Bucky in this?
Well, it's interesting because earlier in the movie, you have Natasha explain her experience with him, and when I was rewatching, there were a couple of notes that I made that were actually very interesting that related to Civil War too. So that'll make that conversation really interesting. But it was when she explains like who he is and what he does, Cap is very much like pragmatic about it. He's like, well, we'll stop him. It's this is the whatever they think they have, they don't. And what's so interesting about that scene when he sees his face for the very first time is Cap doesn't know what to do, because he doesn't want to fight him, but he has to,
right? Because
there's other people's lives at stake here. And Bucky's response is, who's Bucky? So like, it's funny because the movie itself, the movie doesn't try and pretend that Bucky's not the Winter Soldier. That was one of the more interesting things that the Russo brothers did. They didn't shy away from it. It kind of reminded me in like the opposite of what like Star Trek Into Darkness did with Khan. They pretended that he wasn't in the movie at all. And certain things aren't so shocking or don't need to be. I mean, I'm one of those people that goes to the theater and I like to like play up scenes like that. So I remember very distinctly when he goes, Bucky, I went,
right.
just because it was like, it's so overly dramatic in the comic book sense of the world that you can't help but be like, I mean, obviously it's Bucky, but I think that it really puts Steve in a really compromising position, both emotionally and physically, because he didn't know. I mean, you watch their fighting in that first, not the first scene, but the scene where he realizes who he is.
Yeah.
And I mean, Cap is doing everything he can not to hurt him.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that we're sort of given this better look at the character too before Cap is, because like you said, it's pretty obvious that it's Bucky, but because Captain America is so caught up in the moment and he's fighting this guy, it might not be instantly recognizable to him that this is Bucky. And that mask he has on does cover a good majority of his face. You know, it's covering his nose, his mouth, and all you can really see are his eyes, and his hair is sort of longer and greasy and sort of just, you know, he's looking like he's sort of just this machine that's being used by Hydra. And it's definitely an interesting dynamic to see them fighting, knowing it's Bucky, and then to not have Cap realize it until later.
Yeah, I mean, he had that lovely eyeliner, all over his face. Yeah, no, it definitely, I think that, especially because the whole movie is up until that point, you're very suspicious. I mean, I remember reading, I couldn't even tell you where because it was a while ago, but I remember reading when the Russo brothers were like crafting the plot of um Winter Soldier and Civil War at the time too, actually, because there is some setup there. Um, he one of the Russo brothers said that one of the hardest things about creating this situation for Steve was operating under the idea of what won't the character do? What
Right.
is Steve's limit of, I mean, what will drive him to, he doesn't want to kill people, but like what would drive him to do that? And they said that one of the interesting things is when you start exploring that, how you start to feel very like disingenuous to the character in certain things. Like Steve wouldn't kill someone. So, that scene on the roof with Sitwell, they throw him off the roof, and he even says like, I won't do it, but she will.
Right.
And it played off that they played off that dynamic of everyone else they had in the situation, so that Cat was able to just be himself. So, in the elevator when he says, just before we get started, does anyone want to get off? He's still very much the super soldier he was in the first movie. He's now existing in the real world, and he doesn't know, that actually, and I guess we'll get to it in a minute, but the scene when he meets Sam for the first time when they're running,
Yeah.
and they talk about what it's like to be a soldier, that fits really well with the scene later when he finds out it's Bucky, because the only person who could understand really that, aside from being a soldier, or being a part of like Sam's group, is Bucky. I mean, they were in it together. They were the Howling Commandos. So like to have that juxtaposition of the two friendships, one very new and one very, very old, it definitely makes Cap's whole it changes his whole perspective. His whole world goes upside down.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned how he meets Sam, because I did want to talk about that, and I was going to mention that next, actually. And it's almost like they sort of already know each other by the time you finish that scene, and know each other pretty well, because, Cap is totally outrunning him when they're, running around DC and everything like that, around the monuments and what have you. And, Sam makes this comment as he can tell Cap is approaching. He's like, "Don't you say it," or something like that, because he keeps saying "on your left." And it's just such a comical moment that it feels like, from the get-go that these two characters are going to get along really well. And that's before they even formally introduce themselves, which, Sam obviously is aware of who this dude is because he's running like a maniac around in these laps around him. And I just really like how they brought those two characters together, and they sort of let that be the opening scene for the film, because it's just like, this is Cap living his current everyday life, and this is sort of how he ends up meeting people. It's not like he's really in tune with the typical ways that you meet people. It's not every day that you meet someone because they're flat out outrunning you, and it's just really interesting to show how different Cap is from sort of your everyday soldier even.
Right. Well, I think it's that whole scene is very, very, very funny, because Sam, after they introduce themselves, he's like, oh, come down to, the VW or whatever it is, because there's a girl he wants to impress. So they bond really, really quickly, but they're very different people. And that's what makes it interesting because, Cap shares the fact that he has a list of things that like he's trying to catch up on. And but then the scene kind of ends really like it's very complete with Natasha pulling up going, anyone know where the Smithsonian is?
Yeah.
because of that, there's a very light, humor to the whole thing. And it also helps show, that like the Natasha Steve bond really well too, that she also decided like, hey, I'll work for Shield too, I'll hang out in DC also after the Avengers. And I thought that was a really interesting choice, especially because on a more larger scale note, Chris Evans and Scarlett Johansson have worked together before.
Yeah, and it's always really great to see that friendship that those two have because she's sort of nagging him the entire movie to ask someone out. And it's just like, she makes the comment, I'm multitasking. like these are both things that she, one, should be doing and wants to be doing because you can just tell how she's just sort of trying to get him acclimated to, the new times and everything like that. And it's funny that he even has that list in a notebook because most people these days would just put that in their phone or something, which I'm someone who still really loves to use notebooks. So I found it sort of interesting that he was doing it that way. Like he hadn't quite caught up with the times, like pen and paper is still his thing. And he just, pulled them out of his pocket as he was running. So who really keeps a notebook on them when they're running like that,
Yep, he has to. Well, what was interesting about the Natasha, I mean, there was a lot of really interesting things about the Natasha Steve relationship aspect of the movie, but in Winter Soldier, I got the impression that she didn't know about Peggy because he was so like obstinate and her way of doing it is like it sounds like, oh well, you can't be hung up on the girl from the 40s. She's it seemed to me like she assumed that everyone he loved was dead, and that's true. I mean, we do see Peggy and it's very upsetting, but he it's interesting because she's the one who shows up to Peggy's funeral in Civil War,
right?
Which, spoiler alert, I guess, but she did know. And what she was doing was it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to bring you into the 21st century. She was trying to help him. And I thought that was really an interesting choice, especially by the Russo brothers, because of what has been done to Natasha in other movies. I mean, I'm very pro solo Scarlett Johansson movie,
right?
But because she can handle it. But a Black Widow movie would be great because it would be a spy thriller. But she's so well utilized for the film, and even the fact that we get to see her later with Sam, and what's so interesting about Winter Soldier is how much you don't even realize how much it informs the rest of the MCU.
Yeah, and I think they use her, like you said, very well in this, and she's not just along to be Steve's sort of support system. It's like, yes, she's acting as a friend to him, but we see when they go on that huge ship and everything that she has her own separate mission from whatever Steve is doing. And I think the fact that they didn't put her in this spot where it's just like, hey, make sure things go smoothly with Steve and everything like that, because he's Captain America, he can handle himself and he doesn't really necessarily need other Avengers with him to complete a mission. So the fact that they gave her her own mission, I think made a lot more sense and really showed, like you said, those spy skills that she is so used to using already. And I think, when they go into, I don't really know if it's a bunker or if it's just the old SHIELD office or what exactly it is, because it
It's
sort of looks like
both.
both. Yeah.
It's both, because it was the hiding place of Shield. So it was a bunker. It's kind of like what they do in Agent Carter, where she works for the telephone company,
Right,
but
right.
behind the telephone company. Yeah, it was, the bunker was used as a, like, oh, this isn't anything, nothing shady going on here.
Yeah, and when they're in there, there's that picture of Peggy on the wall, and Steve sort of just lingers on it. And I think that's really, when it clicks for her that, hey, he's really still hung up on this person. And like you said, she doesn't really know where Peggy is, if she's still alive or that sort of
Right.
thing, but we do. So it's just one of those moments where you sort of see how she asks Steve about it, and it's not in a pushy kind of way, but it's in more of a caring sort of way.
That scene is so fascinating because you learn so much, because that's the other scene that totally flips Steve and all of our perspectives, because you learn that Shield is actually Hydra. And I mean, that line, everything you've worked for has, amounted to nothing, or whatever it is. The organization you tried to stop is here still, alive and well. Um it's so fascinating because when the building blows up, there's a tendency when you have two very good looking leads to still push them together in a capacity that just never works, and the movie works very hard not to do that, but
Right.
it's seamless. And that scene, though, is very interesting because Natasha's aware that she wouldn't make it out alive without Steve. And I found that really, really fascinating because it showed, if we ever, maybe never, I'll write it. If we ever get a Black Widow movie, it's interesting to see that side of her, not in the capacity of her like telling Hulk about her past. It wasn't meant to be vulnerable. It was meant to show that, these people post Avengers have like learned to rely on each other in ways that they've never been able to rely on other people. That's why her story about Bucky is so interesting. I mean, she thought she was going to die.
Yeah, and this by far is probably my favorite depiction of Black Widow in pretty much all of the movies
Yeah.
that they've done with her in them. And I think,
She gets to do so much, so much. I mean, you forget how integral she is to the whole plot. She and Steve are complete equals.
yeah, and even if they did do a Black Widow solo movie, I wouldn't mind if they had Captain America show up in it like she does in this. And he might not necessarily
Right.
need to be in it quite as much because, we find out that when she has that different mission from Steve, he's not exactly too thrilled about it because he wasn't let in on it, basically. And
Right.
that sort of leads into our discussion on his relationship with Fury next, I think, because there's sort of this push and pull between the two of them because, he takes orders from Nick Fury, but he's never really getting the whole picture. And that's something that he's not too fond of. And you really see this. And then when, Nick Fury dies, quote unquote, in this, you still see how much respect that Steve has for him because he is, still his superior.
I found Steve is a very much like, he's a very big picture kind of person.
Right.
So he needs to know, what he's fighting against, what he's fighting for. There's that line at the end of the movie when no, it's in the middle of the movie when he says that's not freedom, that's fear.
Yeah.
And that line actually plays almost, is the entire through line of Civil War. So like, that's partially where you can see where Steve was coming from the start. But it's interesting because on a certain level, the Avengers themselves, they know that they don't know what each other is up to at any given moment. So the fact that Natasha and Steve happen to be in the same place, I feel like it's kind of funny that he doesn't really question why she's hanging around there. Theoretically, she could be anywhere in the world.
Right.
she probably should be. You know, she's in she her skills allow, I mean, that's what we saw in Avengers, and that wasn't even, you know, her introduction was in Iron Man 2, but that's what we saw in Avengers. She was off doing, you know, whatever she was supposed to be doing for Fury. And that's the other thing. You see that, like, Natasha just implicitly trusts, or she does what she's told. I'm not really sure how much of a soldier is she. um she she does what she's told, and she doesn't really question him too much, whereas Steve kind of feels like if he's going to be working for him, for Shield, or under the guise of Shield, he should at least be in on every aspect of it. What he doesn't seem to understand is the why you would need Natasha in the situation, and I thought that was really interesting, because he's not it had nothing to do with, you know, what she should and shouldn't do. It had to do with the fact that, like, if she's going to be given other stuff to do, how is he supposed to know when to get out of the situation if they're supposedly going in together? He felt like she jeopardized them.
Right. And I feel like, you know, she's more inclined to do the things that Steve would have sort of these moral problems doing. You know, her moral line is a little more blurred because of, you know, the past life that she had. And for Steve, he's always sort of been this guy, and he's always been doing things for the good of it. And it's really interesting to see that dynamic come together in this movie. And even with Nick Fury, you know, giving them orders, the fact that they handle them so differently and have sort of these different takes on whether or not they're going to question Fury is really interesting.
Well, it plays up so, like, I mean, this movie was practically its own tentpole for the MCU, because it plays so well into Civil War. I mean, when she gets it, she gets the Steve Bucky thing. She doesn't she for everything else that she criticizes about the way Steve exists in the 21st century, she totally understands why he couldn't agree with the Accords in general, why he couldn't agree with Tony. There was so many facets to that, so that when you see her in that movie, like, semi switch sides, or see how blurred that whole situation is for so many of the Avengers, it you see how crucial this movie was to everything. I mean, just the sheer fact that Fury himself, you know, was at one point in charge. I feel like at the point where we are in the MCU, you can forget that. You know, there are all these characters, and certainly with, like, Agents of Shield, it's so separate at this point that it's so easy to be like, oh, okay, they exist in the same universe, but, you know, not the same things have happened, which was what was so fascinating about that first season. That was so ballsy to just take the first season, bring out what people thought they were watching, and then change the entire narrative halfway through, because they align themselves right with the movie. I mean, I cannot imagine being an executive at ABC and going, I don't know how this is going to work, because the first question that everyone asked after the movie was, oh, I guess Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is getting canceled.
Yeah, and they definitely did a lot of work on that show to sort of revive it after, you know, everything that went on in the movies and everything like that. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit here and talk about, or I should say, talk more about the new characters that they brought about in this film. And we have Sam, who we see become Falcon by the end, and then we have Agent 13, who, ironically enough, Steve tries to ask her out and even, you know, offers to let her use his washing machine and stuff like that. And it's a super awkward scene. And at that moment, it's like you sort of have an idea of who she is, but it isn't really until Fury's in Cap's apartment and she hears the gunfire that we get her true identity, basically. And then she makes more appearances throughout the film. But I think, you know, it was really great to sort of have that soft introduction to her character first and then see, you know, what her real mission was or her role in this. And, you know, I know things play out quite differently in Civil War than maybe some of us wanted to with her character and Cap and everything like that, but here they don't have any real relationship. It's like she was assigned this, you know, Overwatch position for Captain America, basically to make sure he's safe in his apartment, and we see her later in the offices. So what do you think of how they introduced this character and what role they gave her in this?
Well, one of my favorite moments is actually when he passes her in the office and he goes neighbor because he's so mad that he didn't know. He's
Yeah.
so mad that there were people watching him, and he just like his own skills at, like, I don't know, paying attention are not very good. He's just trying to live his life, but he's so mad that, like, no one is who they say they are. And I feel like they did, like, a really good job of building all of that, like, distrust around everything else, because prior to that, Steve had no reason to distrust anyone or anything. He felt like, all right, I'll go work for the government agency that Peggy started because of me. And then everything else turns out to be a mess. So I think that seemed like, if had they been able to I don't know, flesh out that particular moment in another scene in the movie, I feel like people wouldn't have been as upset about what occurred in Civil War. Because there's nothing, the issue I think with Agent 13 is, and Sharon Carter in general, is that there's nothing earned about it. So, like, when she was, in a way, you know, you could take the Bucky line. When she was, when Steve was her mission, it worked better, I think, because she was unassuming. And you know, you definitely don't think that, like, Fury has this whole network of people doing what they're doing, which is why it's so interesting after he dies that Steve takes up that aspect of his run of Shield, because they want to figure out what's going on, or, you know, quote unquote dies. But Sharon herself is, what made her so interesting is they did a lot in such a short amount of time. Like, at the end of the movie, when Steve makes his announcement over the loudspeaker and you see her reaction, you're like hyper aware of her at that point, that she, you know, you want to see her do something.
Right.
And I think that's why at the end of the movie, when she joins the FBI, you're it's gratifying, it's satisfying. You're like, oh, okay, Sharon is she's, you know, at that point you don't even know technically that, you know, she's Peggy's niece, but at that point she you're like, oh, okay, she's doing her aunt proud, because at least for those of us who knew who she was, you know, you were like, okay, she has a sense of morals here that align with the rest of the people that are involved. You know, it was very much validating, like, oh, okay, she'll do. My issue with her in general is that she kind of fulfilled the role of actual Peggy in the comics, which was very annoying. Peggy is not the cool person that Haley Atwell brought to the character, and Disney itself. She didn't need straight up rescuing and stuff like that, but she was very, very needy, very she was written very, I don't know, I want to say like one dimensional in a way, because there was, as we see in the movies, I mean, Peggy's still a fan favorite. I love Peggy. Give me all the Carters. Just like, I'll watch a whole family of them. And I think that it would have been very interesting if they also, you know, had shown, you know, there's so many scenes that they could have used with Sharon. I know they didn't want us to know who she was, but, you know, kind of like how we were talking before about how they showed us stuff with, like, Bucky earlier on. It would have been interesting to see her, you know, a very quick moment of her visiting Peggy or something like that, you know, because the thing is that she has the potential to be fleshed out in this movie, and then that's like forgotten. We're just supposed to assume that like it was fleshed out. And I feel like that sort of messed with the reveal of Sharon and stuff like that, because she was fulfilling one role and one role only, whereas like even Peggy in that one scene, I mean, there's also the archival footage in the museum, where she talks about how she met her future husband. Um, she Peggy is still very much herself, and I feel like Agent 13 was immediately pushed into that position, even without knowing that she was, working for Shield and any of that, as like a love interest for Steve. And I think that they had the potential to allow her to be her own person, and they started to go in that direction, and then they didn't. So her intro, it works, but it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think it's actually the CIA she ends up going to, which would explain
Yeah.
she's overseas
Right.
more and everything like that, which,
Right.
all these agencies get them all confused. But, she takes that next step in her career, too, that will sort of play into Civil War better, I would say, for, those purposes of everything they do with her in that movie. And I think here, because of the fact that we just know her as Agent 13, really, which it seemed odd to me because it feels like everyone else has a name and she's just this number. And I was like, okay, it felt a little weird to just hold that back. And like you said, if they had given her a scene visiting Peggy like we saw with Cap, I think that would have played really well. And I think,
I feel like he spends so much time being mad at her that that's why it doesn't make sense later, because he's mad that she was, following him, and then he's mad that he didn't know she was related to Peggy.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like they fell short, because for sure, especially in a world where Bucky has come back, Steve would have loved. He doesn't. The part of my issue is that he doesn't need to fall in love with the relative of Peggy. She's not the same person, so
Right.
there's no reason for that. But he would have loved to have someone who he could talk about her with, who knew her, probably not remotely in the same capacity that he did, but he just would have loved to know what happened. She can't remember, and that's like the shame of it all. And so all of their conversations are very, when he needed someone like Agent 13, especially with Bucky back, because poor Steve is just super confused because all of these people are in the 21st century, but they're not. Peggy is the age she's supposed to be. He's not. He doesn't know how to reconcile with that. And then Bucky, who was dead, who he had dealt with his death. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
He had made peace with it. He blamed himself because that's what they all do. But he had made peace with it. And that's where that important conversation with Black Widow comes in, about how, Bucky was all he had when he had nothing. And I think what actually ironically makes it all work is Sam, because he's the most normal of them all. So, even his reveal is very like, well, I didn't tell you what I did. He's very, not only is he game because he clearly admires Cap, but he was doing just as heroic stuff when he was overseas. You forget, I think, especially when he says actually Agents of Shield does it a lot too. You forget like the stuff that Tony Stark has created for the MCU. So when Sam says that he's just a soldier, you just think, oh, okay, he's like Rhodey. And you don't make any grander, you forget that Stark Industries was in the weapons business.
Right.
And they play on that a lot, especially even in like other technology things, like, with the handprint on the elevator, all of that stuff. There's some stuff I'm like, I wonder if that'll exist one day.
Yeah, and real quick with Agent 13, it's like,
Yeah.
people in S.H.I.E.L.D. have to know who she is, and they are clearly,
Right.
blatantly keeping that from Cap, and it's just one of those moves where Fury probably isn't telling him everything that he maybe should know, because like you said, I do think that if he knew this was Peggy's niece this whole time, it would have been a totally different dynamic, and it's something that probably would have helped him even a little more, just sort of cope with everything going on, instead of having him just be, confused that Bucky's alive, mad that his neighbor was like keeping an eye on him, and that Fury bugged his place, and all these things that came up throughout this film. But like you said, going to Sam, he is the most normal of everyone, even though he did serve. And I think, when you see him as Falcon, he's sort of just in his clothes and has, the wings attached and the gear attached and everything like that. He doesn't have like a full on superhero suit. So he really does still look like a soldier. And like you said, he makes that comment to Steve, I didn't say I was a pilot. He
Right.
just said, Steve just inferred that based on what he was describing. And, in a way, he is a pilot because he's piloting the suit. It's just not the kind of pilot Steve thought he was.
Well, he also he saw his partner go down, so all of it's funny what you automatically think of when you hear certain words, because there's nothing suspicious about what he says. In fact, that's what I think is so great about Sam's apartment scene, because Steve is like, I can't believe I got you involved in this. Like, I'm so sorry, because he feels like he just like murdered him, and Sam is like, what are you talking about? This is fine. And what I think was so interesting also is how game he was. He ends up being like, so crucial, especially in that scene where they go after Sitwell, because he's the one that they pretend that they're gonna shoot him, and he's not a Natasha,
Right.
but Natasha has to do what she's good at. So it's very interesting watching. So much of that movie is spent in disguise that I feel like it made the rest of the stories, not only are you not supposed to know who to trust, but then on top of that, there's so much outside the suit. In fact, the suit that he ends up needing is the one in the museum. And I think that added a dynamic, because I'm a big fan of superheroes outside of the suit, because it shows who they are as people. I think a great example of that is actually Matt Murdock, in the early Daredevil series, because you get to know him outside of the suit, and then all of a sudden he puts it on and you're like, oh, okay, so now he is, the devil of Hell's Kitchen. It's not quite the same with Steve. He was wearing the quote unquote costume way before he was Captain America, in
Right.
the capacity that he becomes Captain America. And I think that's interesting, because especially because that outfit wasn't made for fighting. It was made for prancing around a stage, which he hated. So I think that it was interesting in terms of the overall plot of the conspiracy theory, which, to the Russo brothers' credit, I mean, to achieve that on film in the capacity that they did, when you're reading a book, it's very easy to send people on wild goose chases, because you're trusting these characters, and this was very much the same thing, but it is very difficult to execute on film to the capacity that they did it. I mean, that's the reason it's one of the favorites, is because it's one of the few that it leaves you utterly stunned. You're an entire organization that you thought could be trusted is destabilized. I mean, they are all a part of Shield. You go back to Thor, even, and when you meet Clint and all of that stuff. I mean, Shield, was the throughway line up until that movie.
Yeah, and I do want to move on to some general discussion on the film here in a minute, but
Yeah.
what I found interesting was, when Falcon shows up and everything, and he's been in action, but then you have them in the transport vehicle, and Maria Hill makes her appearance there, and she sort of is just like, who's this guy? And no one really knows who Sam is, and I think that's what makes him an interesting complement to Natasha and Cap, because he's this guy, he's not doing it because he wants everyone to know who he is. He's doing it because he's like, hey, Cap needs my help. And I don't recall Nick Fury, when we find out he's still alive, sort of questioning why this dude is here that he's never met. It's like, Maria Hill has the sense to do this, but I think Fury's just so tired of everything. He's like, all right, someone else. Okay, here we go. And it's just interesting how,
I always had the sense that Nick Fury could sense an Avenger.
Right.
It reminds me of the line in Ultron that, Hawkeye tells Scarlett Witch, you step outside that door and you're an Avenger. And I always got the feeling that, like, especially if Cap is hanging around someone,
mm-hmm.
Nick Fury is not going to doubt it. He's
Yeah.
probably in his mind, he was like, oh, he made a friend, thank God. But I always got the sense that, like, he definitely, he can see people, ironically, for what they are. And Sam immediately registers as someone who was, completely trustworthy. And, aside from being totally over it, all of it, I think that Sam, he comes across, it's kind of, it's literally the inverse of Bucky, who is being used the wrong way, but was trustworthy at one point. If Steve walked into, if Bucky wasn't being, controlled and all that, if Steve walked in to find, Fury alive and he was with Bucky, I feel like no one would doubt it either, in a very, perverse kind of universal way. Just because that's what makes it interesting. Everyone knew about Bucky. That's why I didn't think Natasha knew about Peggy, because there's so Bucky is Steve's hero. And so to see him take on this other role is partially also what makes it so confusing. But yeah, I think Nick Fury he just gets a good read on people. He doesn't deal with people he doesn't, trust. I feel like that's what played so much into, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. bringing Coulson back. The world needs these people. And that's very much how Nick Fury sees the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get into some more general discussion about the film and everything, I think it's safe to say, we both enjoyed this one a bit more than the first film, which, that film was a perfectly fine first Captain America movie. It's just, it didn't seem to hit on all cylinders just yet, and I think they did a better job with this, with the balance of the characters and everything like that. And I think they were able to take a very serious situation in this film and still find those moments to add some humor to it, like I mentioned with the Maria Hill line of who's this guy. And then you have that great Fury moment towards the beginning where he's sort of just under attack by all the fake police officers, the fake SWAT team and everything. And he's talking to his car, and it responds with, air conditioning is fully operational. And that's like the only thing that's working properly. And you just see this annoyed look on his face, and it's just like everyone is out to annoy him at this very moment, including the AI on his car.
Yes. Yeah, I think that it was very natural for these characters to, it goes back to also Steve's line in the elevator about everyone getting out. The humor was very well interwoven, especially because you were watching both Steve's personal destabilization and the destabilization of S.H.I.E.L.D. And even at the end, when Sam needs rescuing, and he yells at Fury about what floor he said he was on.
Yeah.
And Fury was like, close enough. Like, you're fine.
Yeah, he was like, they don't put the numbers on the outside of the building.
Yeah. You know, they knew their moments, and it's interesting because the right after that you go back to Steve and Bucky fighting, and it's that scene itself is incredibly emotional. What I want to say about this movie is they don't use the slow motion like they did in Captain America, the first movie.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I don't even think they use it at all, but if they do, it's definitely much better than the other movie because it's not overdone. But I don't think they do. Even the scene where the bunker caves in is everything happens very fast. You forget that movie, how long that movie is, because everything just starts going down really, really quickly. Really quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something I wanted to bring up too, because, you know, last time I linked to FX Guide for how they made Steve look so small and everything, and they did a huge breakdown on this film with sort of like a ton of the different CGI effects they used and everything like that. And when I was watching this, I was like actively waiting for those slow motion moments that I particularly wasn't fond of, and I don't really recall any of them. They maybe used it once, if that, and I don't even know if they did that, because a lot of the fights and everything, it's like these fights need to happen in real time because there are huge stakes here, and you don't want to sort of draw out the fights between Cap and Bucky, because I don't think that would have been quite as effective. You need to have this stuff happening in real time so you can sort of see their thought process happen in real time too, especially with Cap when he realizes it's Bucky. You know, if they would have done slow motion there, it would have just felt so weird and so out of place. And it's like, you sort of need to be thinking on your feet in these situations, and you see that happen the minute he's unmasked, basically.
The shield throw outside of his apartment is also done in real time when Bucky catches it.
Yeah.
You would think if they're gonna slow anything down, it would be that moment, but all the camera does is linger on him holding it, and then he throws it back. But you would think if they wanted to be all artsy and everything. What's interesting is also it played right into Bucky's fighting style, because on the bridge right before Steve finds out who he is, when he takes the wheel out of the car, everything that whole scene is done very, very quickly, and it's meant to, because Bucky just, you know, I mean, not only is he being controlled to do whatever he's told, but I mean, he's just throwing punches. He takes out a knife in that other scene. But the whole scene starts because he takes the door off the car and throws Sitwell out of it. Which is the funniest thing, because that character has been in so many Marvel movies, and then they just did away with him like instantly. And one thing that I actually, after I rewatched the movie, I was on Tumblr and someone made a really, really funny reference. The scene in Civil War when they're in the car and Sam refuses to move his seat. Someone said this is what was in Sam's mind, and it was footage of Bucky like smashing the car in, like the windshield and everything.
Right.
And like Sam's face is like right there, and you forget that like Sam is now working with this guy who wouldn't have had, like, he wouldn't have blinked an eye if he killed him. And so you kind of understand the pettiness that Sam feels toward Bucky later on because of that. And I think it's really funny that carried over, because I definitely, like, that is one of those things that totally went to the wayside afterward. But what's interesting is the overall, like, everyone just kind of, well, the people who do accept that Bucky is Steve's friend, you know, Sam of all people gets it, you know, that's why, I mean, you know, if Sam's partner came back to life and was fighting for the other side, he would have real conflicting feelings about it too. No one can say what they would do in that situation, and I think that that's really interesting it's a very interesting place to put a very like ethically moral, upstanding citizen type of person who does, high school PSAs, like Captain America.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they keep doing that to him. The Russo brothers like to do that. They made him obstinate in, the Accords because he partially because of his own morals, but they like putting him in situations where, there is no blatant what would Captain America do. In fact, it would be a lot easier to answer, almost any of the other Avengers, because he is constantly, he doesn't change his mind. He's very set in what his beliefs and everything, but it is hard to assess what he would do in certain situations because of, the human life at stake, but also because of the people that matter to him. I mean, that's why that ending scene is so poignant when he tells Bucky, finish it, because he is not going to kill him. He won't do it.
Yeah, and on top of Cap having to deal with all of this, Bucky is back and he's not dead and everything like that. You still have the whole Shield and Hydra storyline going on too, and that's happening, literally in the offices and everything like that. And it's one of those movies where it just packs in so much, but it does it well, and it never really feels like there's any downtime in this movie. No. And even the scenes where Natasha and Steve are trying to get away from Hydra and they're in the mall and everything like that, they still find a way to make something as simple as that really interesting. And she's sort of guiding Steve through that because he's not this guy who knows how to hide. He sort of just walks around, goes about his day. Hey, I'm Captain America, no big deal, and everything like that. Whereas she has the mindset to be like, okay, they're there. And I think it's Steve who points out, how many of them there are and everything. So he has some of that ingrained in him, but she has the sense enough to be like, okay, we'll go this way. Okay. And she, on the escalator, she turns around, she's like, kiss me, and he's just so thrown by it. And then, he sort of understands it after it happens, like why she did that, because, the other guy is coming up the escalator and would see them. And it was just one of those moments where, they're not trying to force them together. It's like, this is a practical thing that they're doing. And I
felt like that was very much it was very much a moment like, see, this is not what this movie is about at all. She even says, like, public displays of affection make people uncomfortable. I do like, though, that she picks on him later about it, because it was like, he trusted her in the moment, and the minute they're out of danger, she's like, so was that your first kiss in 90 years? Like, and his response is so vague, because he says he's 90, not dead, or something like that. Who's he kissing? I was going to say, especially because she was picking on him about dating. Like, maybe he's not having a problem.
Right. And it's just one of those moments where you can tell she's sort of just wanting to be friends with Steve and help him out. Yeah. And, she's going to do the things typical friends do and make fun of him along the way. And I really like that dynamic, again, that they just have there with those two characters. And I think, how they handled that is really what could set up a great Black Widow solo movie too, because you see her doing these things that she could easily be doing on her own. It's just, she happens to be buddies with Captain America, and they happen to be working on something in the same place at the same time.
I remember in an interview, I think it was with Sebastian Stan, he talked about how there was a day of filming and all he did was have Scarlett Johansson on his shoulders. And they were like, oh, it must have been like a pretty terrible day of filming. And what's funny is that's like her go-to move with him, because she uses that wire
Right.
like restrain him, and she does it in Civil War too. And they made a comment like that he's like, yeah, that's just how I spend my time, like because she she was so much her own character doing her own thing. um and she had the history with him, which I thought was a really, really valuable thing to add to the story, because for her to understand what Steve might be feeling about seeing Bucky again took a lot of empathy that I'm pretty sure the Red Room itself did not encourage, and you would think she doesn't have, but she does, because again, he tried to kill her, and when push came to shove, she understood that Steve wasn't gonna he wasn't gonna let Bucky die again. And that was, that was really significant. I mean, that with you to the end of the line is that line is, in- that might as well be Steve Rogers' tagline, because that's, you know Bucky is everything, and I think that that's where the Sharon Carter stuff falls short, because they could have built her up a little bit in Winter Soldier instead of waiting till years later in Civil War. They could have shown her in Ultron too, but I feel like because the Bucky Cap thing is so pervading, and I mean, strictly on my own personal level, not even in like a romantic way. It's just you have this friendship. I mean, the more you learn about Bucky and Steve, we get that flashback in the movie. The more you see why, it's not just a moral thing. Steve can't lose him again. He can't. Because he made peace with it. He cannot lose him again. And that's why it's so interesting that, we start to see Bucky come to a little bit. Saves him at the very end of the movie, and then he goes to the museum to find out, who he is. It's, Bucky gets his own, Bucky is the tool in the movie, and he too gets his own opportunity to be his own person again. I mean, we see how that plays out too. But the movie was very complete. It left a lot of questions,
Right.
which is just the kind of thing you want, but it didn't leave you going, oh, okay, it wasn't like some other superhero movies where they pack it in with, villains and stuff like that, just so that it keeps the story, interesting. They relied on the belief system that Cap has, and then went from there. And I think that not only did it work really well, but it was all encompassing. I mean, again, this could have been the tentpole instead of the original Captain America movie, because so much changes after this movie.
Yeah, and they do wrap some things up in the aftermath and everything like that, like when we see Agent 13 go to the CIA, which for me, it made
Right.
more sense because she didn't necessarily have these strong ties to any of the Avengers, but then Maria Hill moving over to working with Stark or for Stark, that makes sense because, she's clearly familiar with Cap and Black Widow and sort of the whole team there, whereas Agent 13 was assigned to Cap, but she didn't really have quite as much interaction with them. So I think her sort of doing her own thing and going to the CIA and seeing where that takes her, which we sort of find out in Civil War anyway, makes a lot of sense for those two supporting characters. And there's still sort of these open-ended questions. It's like, okay, well, what's next for Sam? Because he did such a great job helping out here. And that also gets addressed later too.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, and I think that it was done well too. It wasn't trying to tie up
Right.
the loose ends. It just it worked too. And what's nice is that, because Sam was supporting, we get to see him very quickly after that. What he's up to with his, Avenger training in Ant-Man. And he and that's the other thing. Sam he has that line the who are the bad guys, because they're fighting against Shield.
Yeah.
And Cap says, if they're shooting at us, they're the bad guys. And it was an interesting, because that also that played right into, you have these two soldiers who have, Sam definitely has had, especially, regarding, whatever particular war they were fighting, or fight they were fighting. Uh right, because Tony goes to Iraq in the first movie.
I think so.
So Sam, he's been in those compromising positions. He's had to make some really tough choices, and so to be fighting against this organization that was supposed to be, something, I think, it definitely, it also, it helped that scene in the beginning when he says, he can't sleep, he doesn't really know what to do with himself, because he's so used to a certain way of life. Being an Avenger, like, it makes sense to Sam at the end of the movie, and I think that really fit really well with everything we get to know about him.
Yeah, and it's not like they're just giving it to him as a reward. It's, he's proven himself without sort of needing any recognition prior to this, or, I mean, it is funny when he goes, here's my resume, as if he's applying for a job. And then he gives Cap the file on the Falcon suit and everything like that. And he's just eager to help because, it's so ingrained in him that that's what he's supposed to do. And while he's perfectly fine living this normal life and everything, he's also up for some more action and everything like that, because they even talk about, whether or not they miss it and everything when Cap goes to visit him at the VA and he's in the meeting and everything, right, heading the meeting and everything like that. And I think they just do a really good job of building up his character bit by bit throughout the movie. It's not like we have to see all of Sam all at once. You get these little pieces of his character, and the way they sort of have that play out works really well into him just naturally becoming part of the team.
Well, I love that he's sitting there at the end. I mean, of course, the on your left side, the on your left line was going to come back.
Yeah.
They, that's like a big movie rule. If it's in scene, 1, it's got to be in, scene 21, or more. But so you knew that was going to come back. But on top of that, the iPod was playing the music that he suggested. They were showing that, again, it was the total inverse of Bucky. Bucky saved him, but Bucky tried to kill him. And then you have Sam, there. And it was an interesting scene because, like, you don't really think of, Steve Rogers going to the hospital. He was really horribly injured, but, it's not part of his arsenal of, super soldier to heal himself. So, you really don't think of that, especially because, going back to the first movie, his threshold of, like, he was in pain all the time when they list all of the stuff that's, like, wrong with him. I mean, his threshold for pain is insane. So that's, and that's why that, being a super soldier, there are things that probably hurt that don't hurt as much for him, because prior to it, he already wasn't, letting the pain bother him. So there's that scene is super, it's always been very interesting to me because it's playing on a lot of different things that the movie set up. But you also, like, you forget that these people are human, especially because, Natasha walks away from the situation without a scratch and is off in the courtrooms and everything, letting, herself be out there, all of her aliases and all of that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting what they do at the end there. And, I think we've covered quite a bit here. So before we sort of wrap this up entirely, is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you want to touch on?
Don't think so. I think, pretty much said everything that I had written in my notes.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll have you back on for Civil War, which I know there's a lot of stuff, like you said, that leads into that, especially with, Agent 13 coming back and everything like that. And I feel like
it's practically an Avengers movie, so there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah, it still sort of confuses me that it's Captain America Civil War. I'm like, but everyone's in it, so is it really a Captain America movie? But, based on...
Thor is not there. He would be mad.
Yes, there is no Thor, but then, we get Ant-Man and everything like that. So, we get some new additions to the team and everything like that, or teams, Spider-Man. I should say. Yeah, so we will definitely have you back on for that. But thank you so much, Julie, for coming on. This was definitely a great conversation, and I was rewatching it and I was like, oh, I know we're going to be talking about this and this and this, just based on the first conversation we had and everything like that. But, just a reminder, you guys, I will put that huge FX guide post in the show links and everything, because it is really long. Julie, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, but there's like videos and, I think one or two of the videos might have been pulled or something like that, but there's a ton of video footage to go with it on how they did this movie, and it's very extensive. I didn't even make my way all the way through it. I sort of just read the subheaders and everything and was like, okay, they cover this and this and this. So I still have some reading to do too. But again, thank you so much, Julie, for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the Civil War conversation.
Me too. And of course, to the listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.